They called it suicide long before the first boot touched the sand. They said it in officers' tents with a shake of the head. They said it in newspaper rooms with a smirk. They said it in the comfortable distance of northern parlors where war was something other men did far away. A black regiment leading the assault on a Confederate fort built to swallow men in the dark. They said it was madness. They said it would fail. They said it would prove what they already wanted to believe. And that is exactly why the 54th Massachusetts was chosen. And exactly why what happened next could not be buried forever. Because if they broke, the country would point to the wreckage and call it evidence. And if they held, if they climbed, if they bled and kept moving, the country would be forced to look at a truth it had been avoiding since the first shots of the war. That freedom was not a speech. It was a debt paid in bodies, and black soldiers were going to collect. The story begins not on a battlefield but in the cold arithmetic of 1863, when the Union had learned that winning a war and preserving a nation were not the same thing as transforming it. In January, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation changed the legal shape of the conflict, turning the war openly against slavery in rebelling states and opening the door, at least on paper, for black men to fight in Union blue. But doors can open while the people inside still don't want you there. Many northern whites supported ending slavery and still doubted black soldiers. Many commanders wanted manpower and still feared the politics of putting rifles in black hands. Even in the Union, the idea that black men could fight, could lead, was treated like a wager, and wagers have winners and losers. Massachusetts Governor John Andrew decided to make the wager public and unavoidable. A regiment raised in the North, recruited from free black communities, and from men who had escaped bondage, trained to the same discipline as any other unit, and put under a spotlight bright enough that every critic would have to watch. They needed an officer to command it who would be taken seriously by the white establishment, and they needed him young enough to be shaped, brave enough to risk his career, and stubborn enough to accept that the regiment's true battlefield would be America's mind. They chose Robert Gould Shaw, 25 years old, wealthy, educated, and initially uncertain, a man who had grown up with abolitionist ideas in the air but had never needed to test them with consequence. Shaw's letters from the early period don't read like propaganda. They read like a man being forced to grow up faster than he expected. He accepted the commission, and the 54th began forming at Camp Meigs in Reedville, outside Boston, where drill fields became a proving ground not only of military readiness but of dignity under pressure. The men trained hard because they understood what everyone would do with their mistakes. They learned to march with shoulders squared while people stared, to handle muskets with the care of men who knew a dropped weapon would become a headline, to respond to commands with precision while slurs floated from the sidelines. Weren't just building a unit, they were building an argument. And the worst part was that the argument still had to be made with unequal tools. The federal government decided black soldiers would be paid less than white soldiers, a smaller wage with deductions for clothing that white soldiers didn't face in the same way. Imagine the message: die for the Union, but do it at a discount. The 54th refused to pay for months, making a stand that cost them money and comfort, because they understood something larger than daily survival. If the nation could ask for their blood but not their equality, the war would end and the old hierarchy would simply return with a new mask. Shaw backed them, risking his own position, while the men held the line in the quiet way that doesn't make battlefield paintings but changes the meaning of a uniform. When the regiment finally shipped south, the suicide talk didn't stop. It only changed accents. In the Sea Islands of South Carolina, where the Union foothold sat amid a hostile coastline, the 54th saw the war up close. Plantations, hunger, fear, enslaved people watching silently from the edges of camps, and Confederate forces ready to crush any symbol of black military power as a threat to the world they wanted to preserve. The 54th participated in operations that exposed the cruel reality of the Southern theater: raids, skirmishes, disease, and the constant knowledge that capture for black soldiers could mean execution or enslavement rather than conventional prisoner of war treatment. Every step forward was made with the awareness that the rules of war often did not apply evenly. Yet the regiment's discipline held, and their reputation began to change among men who had mocked them. Not because opinions suddenly became pure, but because war respects what works. And in July 1863, on the coast near Charleston, one of the Confederacy's symbolic hearts, the Union planned an assault on Fort Wagner, a strong sand and earth fortification on Morris Island that guarded approaches and helped protect Charleston Harbor. The fort was designed to be hard to take: thick walls, angled defenses, guns positioned to shred attackers along the narrow strip of beach they had to cross. Veterans looked at the layout and saw the math: a frontal assault in low light against prepared defenders with limited room to maneuver, across open sand toward walls and ditches and concentrated fire. It wasn't merely dangerous. It was the kind of plan that makes soldiers speak in short words and swallow hard before they move. If the assault stalled, men would be trapped on the beach with nowhere to hide. If coordination failed, units would collide. If the defenders held, bodies would pile in the same choke points. The phrase suicide wasn't poetic, it was tactical. And then came the decision that turned the plan into a statement. The 54th Massachusetts would lead. It would be the first regiment into the mouth of that fort. Some argued it was an honor. Others understood the uglier possibility that if black soldiers led and died, the Union could spend their sacrifice to buy momentum and still deny them credit afterward. Shaw understood the weight of it, and he also understood the opportunity. If the 54th went first and faltered, every racist in America would point and say, "We told you." If they went first and fought with undeniable courage, the country would be forced, at least momentarily, to admit what it had tried to keep theoretical. On the evening of July 18, 1863, the air along the shore carried salt and smoke, and the light began to fade into the kind of dusk where distance becomes uncertain and fear feels closer. The men formed up with the sea on one side and Confederate guns ahead, a narrow corridor of sand that offered no mercy. They carried muskets, bayonets, cartridges, canteens. Some carried private tokens, letters folded small, a Bible tucked close, a cloth strip tied around a wrist. Shaw rode along the line, then dismounted. Because leading a charge from horseback makes you a target and also separates you from the men you're asking to follow you into darkness. He spoke to them in a voice that had to be loud enough to carry and steady enough to matter. Not a romantic speech, not a theatrical one, but the kind of words a man uses when he knows history is about to ask a question, and 1,000 eyes are waiting for the answer. The question wasn't simply whether the fort could be taken. The question was whether the nation would ever again be able to say black men would not fight. And as the 54th stepped forward, boots sinking into sand that swallowed their weight without sound, the world narrowed to the line of earth ahead, the smell of powder in the air and the knowledge that in a few minutes the word suicide would either become prophesied or become proof that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in war is refuse to accept the place the world assigned you. The advance toward Fort Wagner was not a gallant parade. It was a controlled walk into an open wound. The beach on Morris Island narrowed in places, forcing the regiment into corridors where men clustered closer than they wanted. Shoulder to shoulder, with the ocean's dark edge to their right and low dunes and scrub to their left. The fort ahead like a shadow with teeth. In daylight, you could have studied it, measured it, convinced yourself the geometry might save you, but at dusk, with smoke in the air and the first flashes appearing from the parapets, the fort became less an object and more a presence, a thing waiting. The 54th moved under orders. But the men also moved under something older, a survival instinct sharpened by what they knew the Confederacy represented for them. For many, capture was not a neutral outcome. It was a sentence. The Union bombardment that was supposed to soften the fort's defenses had been intense. But fortifications made of sand and earth can absorb punishment in a way brick cannot. And the Confederates inside Wagner had prepared for exactly this kind of night. When the first shells and musket fire began to cut across the approach, sound turned strange, stretched by wind and distance, then suddenly closed as bullets snapped past ears like angry insects. Men flinched, then forced themselves forward. Discipline is not the absence of fear. It is fear taking orders. Shaw went on foot near the front, refusing to be behind his men. And that decision mattered more than any slogan because it told the regiment they were not being spent casually. This was still an army that segregated, that doubted, that underpaid them. But in this moment their commander was sharing the same strip of exposed sand, breathing the same smoke, accepting the same risk, and that created a kind of loyalty that can't be manufactured. The closer they got, the more the beach became a funnel. The fort's defenders could concentrate fire, and the narrow approach limited how widely the 54th could spread. Men fell. Some fell silently, as if the body simply decided it had carried enough. Others cried out, more from shock than pain, because pain often arrives a second later when the mind has time to notice. The regiment had trained for chaos, for the moment when a line becomes a staggered wave, when spacing collapses, when enlisted men must make quick decisions, because an officer's shout can't reach everyone. Through it, color sergeants carried the American flag and the regiment's colors, because flags in Civil War combat weren't only symbols. They were navigation tools, rally points, a way to keep men oriented amid smoke and night. The 54th understood that if the colors fell, the story would fall with them. And so the men around the flags fought like guardians, protecting not cloth but legitimacy. As they reached the fort's outer defenses, a ditch and embankment that formed a deadly threshold, the pace surged. This was the transition from approach to contact, the moment where there is no longer a safe distance. Men jumped into the ditch, struggled in sand that slid under boots, tried to climb the slope toward the parapet, hands digging into earth that didn't offer the grip of stone. Above, Confederate defenders fired downward, and the muzzle flashes lit faces in brief, harsh bursts that made everything feel like a stuttering nightmare. Shaw climbed toward the top, and for a brief moment he was visible against the fort's edge, a silhouette rising where a man should not rise if he wants to live. He urged his men on, and then he was hit and fell. Killed on the parapet, his body dropping into the tangled space between defenders and attackers as the fight raged around him. The loss of a commanding officer is often a moment when a unit breaks, because in the mind of exhausted men, leadership is a handrail, and when the handrail disappears, panic rushes in. But the 54th did not crumble. They surged into the fort's edge and fought for it with bayonets and rifle butts and stubborn momentum, driven by a sense that turning back would not be interpreted as tactical prudence. Turning back would be interpreted as failure of a people, and these men were refusing to be turned into a lesson by their enemies or by their supposed allies. Units behind them tried to follow, and the assault became a knot of bodies, smoke, and confusion where commands tangled and the night swallowed coordination. In the fort, defenders moved along interior lines, reinforcing points under threat, and the attackers struggled in the ditch and on the slope, exposed and compressed. The suicide prediction began to take shape, not because the men lacked courage, but because the plan's geometry was cruel. There was not enough room to maneuver, not enough cover, not enough time to reorganize under fire. Yet the story that lived inside the assault was not simply they died, it was what they did while the plan failed. They held on longer than many thought possible. They reformed where they could. They protected the colors. One of the men, Sergeant William H. Kearney, would be remembered for his actions with the flag, because when the color bearers went down and chaos tried to swallow the symbol, Kearney kept the colors from touching the ground, moving through the fight with the flag as if the cloth carried the unit's right to exist. Later, wounded, he would say words that survived because they were simple and absolute. The old claim that the flag never touched the earth. Whether or not every detail was later polished for retelling, the core truth remained. In the darkest moment, when the fort refused to fall and the beach became a trap, the 54th did not turn the assault into a shameful footnote. They turned it into a forcing event. The regiment suffered heavy casualties, men killed, wounded, missing on a scale that would have broken many units, and when the survivors finally withdrew under order, stumbling back across the sand in smaller clusters, carrying wounded as best they could, the fort still stood. Tactically, the assault failed, but war is not only tactics. The assault exposed the defenders' resolve and the attackers' desperation, and it left behind a story that could not be easily dismissed. Black soldiers had led where other men had hesitated, had faced the worst geometry of the battlefield, and had fought with a discipline and courage that made mockery harder to maintain. The Confederates tried to weaponize Shaw's death by reportedly burying him with his black soldiers in a mass grave, intending it as an insult, a message that a white officer who led black men deserved no separate honor. But even that act twisted into a kind of unintended testimony. Shaw's family later refused reburial, insisting that he could rest where he fell with the men he led, turning the intended insult into a statement of unity and respect. In the North, news of the assault traveled fast, and the story split America down a new line, not between blue and gray, but between those who were willing to see what the 54th proved and those who were determined to reinterpret it until it fit their old beliefs. And in that split, the real battle began, because the 54th's charge at Fort Wagner did not only challenge a Confederate fortification, it challenged the nation's moral architecture, and the shock of that challenge would ripple outward in ways the men on that beach could not yet measure. In the days after Fort Wagner, you could feel the argument changing before it reached paper. In camp, white soldiers who had been skeptical spoke of the 54th with a different tone, not always pure respect. Sometimes grudging, sometimes embarrassed, but altered. War has a way of stripping theory down to outcomes, and the outcome at Wagner was undeniable. Those men went where they were ordered, they did it under fire that would have staggered any veteran unit, and they did not collapse into the stereotype their enemies counted on. Yet the nation still tried to bargain with what it had seen. Some reports praised courage, but framed it as surprising, as if bravery in black men required an asterisk. Political opponents of black enlistment tried to twist the story into tragedy without meaning, claiming the 54th had been sacrificed, pointlessly. and others, including abolitionists and supporters of the Union's new direction, seized on the assault as proof that the war could no longer be fought with only one kind of soldier and still be called a war for a new America. The 54th's losses were heavy. Hundreds out of roughly 600 engaged became casualties in some form, and those numbers mattered because they forced a question. If black soldiers were capable of paying the same price as any regiment, how could the nation justify treating them as less than soldiers? That question didn't resolve instantly. It collided with entrenched prejudice, with political caution, and with the practical hunger for manpower as the war's casualty lists grew longer. But the question began to win, not as a moral awakening, but as a strategic necessity that slowly opened the door wider. Recruitment of black soldiers increased dramatically afterward, and by the war's end, nearly 200,000 black men had served in Union forces in related capacities, a fact that would become central to Union victory and yet still fought over in memory. That surge did not happen because one assault was inspirational in a sentimental way. It happened because Fort Wagner turned an idea into something visible, something newspapers could not ignore and commanders could not deny when they needed bodies to hold ground. For the men of the 54th, visibility came with a cost. Every story about them was contested territory. Their courage was praised, then minimized. Their sacrifice was used, then compartmentalized. Even the details of heroism became subject to who was allowed to be called heroic. Take the colors at Wagner. The reason the flag mattered is because the fight's chaos made symbols function like anchors. And because the nation itself was watching the symbol chain. Could black hands hold the flag of the United States and be accepted as defenders of it? Men like William Carney answered that question with their bodies. Yet recognition lagged behind action. The Union was willing to use black soldiers and still slow-walk their equality in pay, in promotion, in medical care, and public language. The 54th's pay controversy became a second front, one measured not in yards but in months. The men continued to refuse unequal pay, and that refusal was a kind of discipline too, because hunger is a weapon, and the government implicitly attempted to use it to force compliance. The regiment and many other black units held out long enough that the issue became unavoidable, and eventually equal pay would be granted retroactively for many. But even that victory carried the mark of how hard equality had to be forced, not gifted. If you want the story your teacher didn't have time to tell, it's that the suicide charge was only the visible explosion. The slower, quieter battles over paperwork, over whose names appeared in reports, were wars inside the war, and they determined what victory would actually mean after the guns stopped. The 54th continued to serve in operations along the South Carolina coast, and their presence remained a provocation to Confederate forces and a test for Union leadership. For Confederate commanders, armed black soldiers represented a direct threat to the social order they were fighting to preserve. For Union commanders, black soldiers represented both a military asset and a political complication, which is another way of saying the Union was still learning how to live up to its own stated values. The 54th lived inside that contradiction. They were expected to be exceptionally brave, and then treated as if bravery was not enough to warrant full belonging. They were used as evidence that emancipation could be enforced, and then treated as if emancipation was a gift that could be managed. They were asked to march into fire, and then asked to tolerate insults in the same uniform. If that sounds like a moral failure of the era, it was, but it also reveals why the 54th story still matters. It shows that progress in America often arrives not because the powerful decide to be kind, but because people who were denied power decide to be relentless. The legacy of Fort Wagner became a leva, and it was used by people who understood publicity as a form of force. Abolitionists wrote about it. Black communities used it to push for enlistment and equal treatment. Recruitment posters and speeches invoked the regiment's name with a reverence that made it harder to pretend the war was being fought by white hands alone. Even those who wanted to maintain racial hierarchy had to adjust their language because Fort Wagner changed what was plausible to claim. You could still be racist in America after Wagner, of course, but it became harder to claim with a straight face that black men would not fight, would not stand, would not sacrifice. And that shift, subtle, contested, incomplete, mattered because it affected how the Union could sustain the war. Black enlistment bolstered Union numbers, guarded railroads, manned fortifications, fought in major campaigns, and deprived the Confederacy of forced labor that supported its war economy. The 54th was not the only black unit, and their story should not be used to overshadow thousands of others. But they became a symbol because their assault was public and dramatic, and because it occurred at a moment when the nation was deciding what kind of war it was truly fighting. If you zoom in far enough, you can almost see the first draft of the post-war memory being written around them. Some wanted to remember the 54th as a noble exception, a single bright story that allowed the nation to feel generous while keeping the larger reality, the massive, systemic participation of black soldiers, of the central narrative. Others wanted to remember the 54th as the beginning of a new chapter that demanded more than praise, demanded rights. And then there were the men themselves, survivors and families, carrying grief that didn't fit comfortably into commemorations. Shaw's death became a focal point, but the regiment's story wasn't only about a young white colonel. It was about men whose names rarely appear on the first page of history books. Men who returned to a country that still argued whether they were fully human. Men who had proven something in sand and smoke and still had to prove it again at home. Their reality undercuts the cleaner version of the story. The cleaner version says, they charged, they were brave, America learned a lesson, the end. The real version says they charged because they were placed in a position where success forced recognition and failure would be used to justify oppression. They were brave because bravery was survival. America learned a lesson slowly under pressure and then tried to forget parts of it when forgetting became convenient. If you want to understand why this story is titled They Called It Suicide, you have to see the second meaning. The assault was tactically suicidal, but it also threatened to kill an old lie, and that is why so many people resisted the truth of it. Fort Wagner didn't fall that night, but the country's excuse system began to crack, and once cracks appear, the pressure of war can widen them into something that doesn't close again. The easiest myth to teach about the Civil War is that it was inevitable, that it moved like weather, that men were swept into it, and then history moved on. The 54th Massachusetts proves the opposite. People made choices inside the war that changed what the war could become, and those choices carried consequences long after the smoke drifted away. The regiment's charge at Fort Wagner became a story passed down not because it was neat, but because it was inconvenient to those who wanted neatness. It forced the Union to confront the logic of its contradiction. You cannot ask men to fight for a republic while denying them the republic's full promise. The war did not resolve that contradiction in 1863 or even in 1865, but it made it impossible to ignore forever. Over time, the 54th story took on layers of commemoration. Art, speeches, monuments, and every layer came with its own arguments about what the regiment meant. One of the clearest examples is the way recognition and erasure wrestled over their legacy. When the war ended, veterans told stories, newspapers chose what to highlight, politicians chose what to emphasize, and in those choices you can see how a society decides what is central and what is peripheral. Black soldiers were often pushed into the margins of popular memory not because they weren't crucial, but because admitting their centrality demanded changes many Americans resisted. Fort Wagner kept pulling them back toward the center like a magnet. You could omit a statistic in a report, but you couldn't erase the image of a black regiment leading an assault under the eyes of an entire nation. You could bury Shaw with his men as an insult, but you couldn't stop the fact that the burial became, in the hands of those who understood symbolism, a statement about shared sacrifice. You could pay black soldiers less and hope hunger would silence them, but you couldn't maintain that policy indefinitely while using their bravery as propaganda. The 54th did not change the war forever in one cinematic snap. They changed it the way reality changes institutions, by forcing the institution to adapt under pressure until denial becomes more costly than acceptance. That is why recruitment surged. That is why the United States colored troops became a massive element of Union manpower. That is why Confederate leaders feared the social implications of armed black men and responded with threats of harsh treatment, which in turn hardened Union resolve in some quarters and exposed the moral stakes. The 54th story is also a reminder that what is viral today often has a historical ancestor. People then, like people now, were drawn to stories where a group dismissed by the mainstream proves itself under impossible conditions. The difference is that in 1863, proving it could still get you killed twice, once by bullets and once by the official story afterward. If you trace the ripple from Wagner forward, you see it in policy debates over equal pay and the push to credit black service, in the post-war struggle over citizenship, in the long Reconstruction fight that tried to define what emancipation actually meant, and in the backlash that followed when America decided it was tired of confronting its own promises. That backlash is part of the story your teacher might not have time to sit with. Bravery on the battlefield does not guarantee justice at home. Societies can praise sacrifice and still betray the people who made it. Veterans can be celebrated and still be denied the full protection of the law. A uniform can command respect in one place and invite violence in another. The men of the 54th carried that truth into the post-war world, and their families carried it too. Some returned to communities that greeted them with pride and sorrow. Some returned to a nation that treated them as a problem to be managed. Their memory became contested ground, because memory always becomes contested ground when it threatens the comfort of the powerful. The story endures because it does two things at once. It offers a moment of undeniable courage, and it exposes the machinery that tries to control what that courage is allowed to mean. That machinery is not unique to the Civil War. Every era has it. It is the machinery that says, yes, you were brave, but don't ask for too much. The machinery that says, yes, you helped win, but stay in your place. The machinery that turns people into symbols so it can avoid treating them as citizens. The 54th charge was a moment when that machinery jammed, when the nation's attempt to keep black soldiers as an experiment collided with the fact that experiments do not bleed like that unless they are men. And if you want the story your history teacher never told you, it is not only the charge itself, though the image is powerful. The night, the sand, the ditch, the parapet, the flashes, the men climbing where they were told they could not. The larger story is that after the charge, America tried to negotiate with what it had witnessed. It tried to praise without transforming. It tried to remember selectively. It tried, in some corners, to downgrade the meaning of black military service back into a footnote. But the war's own brutal logic made that harder, because the Union needed manpower, and because the moral stakes had been hauled into daylight. By war's end, black soldiers had not only fought, they had reshaped what the Union could claim it was fighting for. The 54th did not win Fort Wagner that night, but they won something more corrosive to the old order. They made it impossible to keep saying, out loud, that black men would not fight for the United States. They made it harder to pretend the war was a white man's story. They made it harder for future generations to claim the nation was remade without black hands on the tools. And that is why, when people called it suicide, they were right in one narrow sense and wrong in the one that mattered most. The plan was deadly. The fort remained. Men died, but the lie died too, or at least it started dying. And some lies are harder to keep alive once they have been forced to stare at reality on an open beach. The 54th Massachusetts changed the war forever, not because they were granted power, but because they took responsibility for a moment the nation wanted to avoid, and they turned that moment into proof. And the final quiet truth is this: in a country built on arguments about who counts, sometimes the most dangerous assault is the one aimed not at a fort, but at the story people tell themselves to stay comfortable.